My name is Michaela Anderson, and at 68 years old, I never thought my own son would tell me I was useless. After my husband Harold died, I moved in with my son James, the boy I raised alone after his father abandoned us. I poured every ounce of love into him, worked countless double shifts as a nurse to give him opportunities I never had. But somehow the little boy who once looked at me with adoration now saw only a burden. The day he told me to stop eating his food in my own house was the day something inside me finally broke. If you're watching this from a place where family means everything, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story might remind you just how precious your loved ones truly are. I spent 43 years as a registered nurse at Memorial Hospital. Those were challenging but fulfilling years, especially the early ones when I was raising James on my own. His father, Richard, walked out when James was just 3 years old. I still remember that rainy Tuesday morning when I found the note on our kitchen table. No warning, no goodbye to his son, just a hastily scribbled note saying he needed his freedom. Freedom from us, apparently. That first year was the hardest. I would put on a brave face for little James during the day, reading him stories and assuring him that Daddy still loved him but needed to be away for a while. Then at night, after tucking him in, I would sit at our small kitchen table and try to figure out how to stretch my paycheck to cover rent, childcare, and groceries. There were nights I went to bed hungry so James could have a proper meal. I picked up extra shifts whenever I could. Weekends, holidays, overnight rotations, I took them all. My supervisor at the time, Nancy, was a godsend. She had raised 2 boys on her own and understood my situation. She would arrange my schedule so I could be home for James's school events and still get the hours we needed to survive. James was a bright child, curious about everything. By the time he was 8, he was already showing incredible talent for drawing and building things. I knew then that he had a future as an architect or engineer if I could just give him the right opportunities. So I scrimped and saved for his education, putting away a small amount from each paycheck into a college fund. Those years weren't all hardship, though. We had our special traditions like Sunday morning pancakes shaped like whatever animal James requested that week. We would spend hours at the public library during the summer, James sitting cross-legged on the floor of the children's section, surrounded by books about buildings from around the world. When James was accepted to the architecture program at State University with a partial scholarship, I felt like all our sacrifices had been worth it. I was 45 then, and while other women my age were thinking about vacation homes or early retirement, I was taking out a second mortgage on our small house to cover what the scholarship didn't. But I never resented it, not once. This was our dream, not just his. It wasn't until James was established in his career that I allowed myself to think about my own happiness again. I met Harold at a community fundraiser for the hospital. He was a retired high school science teacher with a kind smile and patient eyes. After 2 years of dating, we married in a simple ceremony with James as our best man. Those 15 years with Harold were peaceful and sweet. We traveled a bit, volunteered together, and enjoyed a simple life. Harold's heart attack 2 years ago was sudden and devastating. One morning we were having coffee on our porch, discussing plans to visit the Grand Canyon, and by evening I was a widow. The grief was overwhelming, but I had survived loss before. What I hadn't counted on was the financial strain. Medical bills, despite our insurance, depleted our savings. The house Harold and I had shared had a reverse mortgage, so I couldn't stay there after he passed. When James offered to have me move in with him, his wife Amanda, and their 2 children, it seemed like the perfect solution. Their Tudor-style home in Mapleton had plenty of space, including a converted sunroom that would become my bedroom. I would be close to my grandchildren, Lily and Thomas, and could help out around the house while James and Amanda pursued their demanding careers. Those first few months were harmonious. I fell into a comfortable routine of preparing breakfast for everyone before James left for his architectural firm and Amanda headed to her law office. Then I would help get Lily and Thomas ready for school, walk them to the bus stop, and spend my mornings tending to the garden or preparing dinner. In the afternoons, I would be waiting at the bus stop to greet the children with homemade cookies or fruit slices, supervise homework, and play games until their parents returned. The children adored having me there. 8-year-old Lily would sit beside me as I taught her to knit, just as my mother had taught me. 6-year-old Thomas would follow me around the garden, solemnly carrying his little watering can and asking endless questions about each plant and insect we encountered. I shared family recipes with them, stories from my nursing days and tales of their father as a little boy. The recipe for strawberry jam that had been passed down for 4 generations became a weekend project with the children, their small hands stained pink with berry juice as they helped me fill and label jars. James seemed pleased with the arrangement too at first. He would come home from work, loosen his tie, and smile at the sight of a home-cooked meal on the table. Mom's pot roast, he would announce to the children. Nothing better in the world. Those words warmed my heart every time. But as weeks turned into months, I began noticing subtle changes in James. He would arrive home later, his shoulders tense, his responses to the children's excited chatter more clipped. Architecture had always been competitive, but James's firm was bidding on a major downtown development project that would put them on the map nationally if they won it. The stress began to show in small ways. He would wince at the sound of Thomas's exuberant playing. He would question the grocery expenses when I made one of our family's more elaborate recipes. Once he snapped at Lily for leaving her school project materials spread across the dining table, something he would have gently reminded her about before. I tried to ease his burden. I took over more of the household chores, kept the children quieter when he was home, and even started putting aside a portion of my small pension to contribute to the household expenses. But it never seemed quite enough. There was a growing distance in his eyes when he looked at me, something that reminded me of the way Richard had looked in those final weeks before he left. "Is everything okay, James?" I would ask carefully. "Just tired, Mom," would be his standard reply, followed by a quick retreat to his home office. I tried to speak with Amanda about it, but she too was under immense pressure at her law firm, working toward making partner. "He'll be fine once this project is over," she assured me, but the worried crease between her eyebrows told a different story. I didn't know it then, but this was just the beginning of a painful journey that would test the very foundation of our relationship and force me to redefine my worth in my twilight years. As summer turned to fall, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly strained. Amanda's law firm took on a high-profile corporate case that required her to work longer hours, often not returning until after the children were in bed. This left me handling more of the childcare and household responsibilities, which I was happy to do, but it also meant I became the primary parent figure during the week. James and I began to clash over how I cared for the children. What started as gentle suggestions from him turned into criticisms. "Mom, we don't let the kids have dessert on weeknights," he said sharply one evening, when he came home to find the 3 of us enjoying homemade apple crisp. "It was a special occasion," I explained. "Lily got an A on her science project." "We can't make exceptions every time they do well at something," James replied. "That's expected of them, not exceptional." I bit my tongue, remembering how I used to celebrate every one of his achievements, no matter how small. The joy in Lily's eyes dimmed at her father's words, and I felt a pang of sadness for both my grandchild and my son. Financial tensions in the household became more apparent. One evening, I overheard James and Amanda arguing in their bedroom. The mortgage payment increased again, James said, his voice tight with stress, and now the school is asking for technology fees for both kids. I know, Amanda replied wearily. But I'm up for partner next quarter. If I can just make it until then, things will get easier. And what if you don't make partner? James's voice had an edge I rarely heard. We're barely staying afloat as it is. Your mother helps out, Amanda pointed out. Her pension barely covers what she eats, James muttered. Those words stung like a physical blow. Was that how he saw me? As a financial calculation, a burden to be measured against my contributions? I quietly retreated from the hallway, my chest tight with hurt. The first major confrontation came on a Tuesday evening in October. James was working from home racing to meet a deadline for the development project. I could see the stress radiating from him as he hunched over his drafting table in the dining room, surrounded by blueprints and sketches. The children were playing a board game in the living room, their excited voices carrying throughout the house. I was preparing dinner, chopping vegetables for a stew that had always been James's favorite comfort food growing up. Can you please keep them quiet? James called out after a particularly loud burst of laughter from Thomas. They're just playing James, I said, wiping my hands on a dish towel and going to the dining room doorway. Why don't you take a short break? You've been at it for hours. I could make you some coffee. He didn't look up from his work. I don't need coffee, Mom. I need quiet so I can concentrate. This deadline is tomorrow morning. Maybe you could work in your office upstairs, I suggested gently. The door would block most of the noise. James slammed his pencil down and finally looked up at me, his eyes flashing with frustration. I need the dining table for these blueprints. They don't fit on my desk upstairs. Why is that so hard to understand? I flinched at his tone but pressed on, concerned about how tense he looked. I just thought a change might help. You seem so stressed, honey. Maybe I could help you organize these papers a bit. That was when he snapped. Mom, stop interfering. Things are different now. The world has moved on, and sometimes I think you're stuck in the past. Not everything can be fixed with your old-fashioned solutions. His words felt like a slap. I stood frozen, unable to respond as he continued. I'm dealing with complex architectural software city zoning regulations and environmental impact studies. This isn't like when I was building with Legos and needed your help to find the right piece. I was only trying to help. I whispered, my voice barely audible. Well, you're not helping. You're making it worse, he said dismissively, turning back to his work. I retreated to the kitchen, my vision blurring with unshed tears. I mechanically continued preparing dinner, though my appetite had vanished. Later, I served the family and excused myself, claiming a headache, and withdrew to my room. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. When had the lines around my eyes deepened so much? When had my hair become more silver than brown? Aging had happened so gradually that I hadn't noticed its progression until that moment when my son's words forced me to see myself through his eyes, outdated, irrelevant, stuck in the past. That night I heard a soft knock on my door. It was Lily holding a crayon drawing of the two of us in the garden. Are you sick, Grandma? She asked, her small face pinched with worry. Just tired, sweetheart, I said, pulling her into a hug. Daddy was mean, she whispered against my shoulder. Daddy's just busy with work, I explained. Always the peacemaker. Sometimes grown-ups get grumpy when they have a lot to do. He shouldn't be mean to you, she insisted with the simple clarity of a child. "You're the best grandma in the whole wide world." Her words were a balm to my wounded heart. At least to my grandchildren I still had value. After that incident, I made efforts to be less visible, less intrusive. I took the children to the park or library after school to keep the house quiet. I simplified our meals to avoid complaints about grocery costs. I stopped offering suggestions or reminiscing about the past. I became careful not to leave any of my belongings in the common areas of the house. It was as if I was trying to shrink myself to take up less space in a home where I increasingly felt unwelcome. But no matter how hard I tried to accommodate James's changing attitude, the gulf between us continued to widen. Amanda noticed the change in our relationship. One evening, as we washed dishes together after dinner, she said quietly, "He doesn't mean it, you know. James has always been terrible under pressure." "I know," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. The boy who had once written me heartfelt Mother's Day cards seemed very far away from the man who now barely acknowledged my presence. "It'll get better once this project is done," Amanda assured me, but her eyes didn't quite meet mine. I nodded and changed the subject, asking about her work. But inside, a cold realization was taking hold. This wasn't just about stress or a deadline. Something fundamental had shifted in how my son saw me, and I wasn't sure our relationship would ever be the same again. As winter settled over Mapleton, the frost that crystallized on the windows seemed to mirror the coldness growing between James and me. What had begun as occasional tension evolved into a pattern of disregard and dismissal that cut deeper with each passing day. Family dinners, once a time of connection and conversation, became exercises in exclusion. James began making decisions without consulting me, even on matters where I should have had input. One evening, I came down to dinner to discover that James had enrolled the children in an after-school program without mentioning it to me. "But I pick them up every day," I said, confused. "I enjoy that time with them." "Amanda and I decided this would be better for their development," James replied, cutting his chicken with precise movements. "The program offers coding and advanced mathematics." "I could have helped with that," I offered. "I used to help you with your math homework." James exchanged a look with Amanda that I couldn't quite interpret. "That was basic math, Mom. Things are different now." Different. That word again wielded like a barrier between my world and theirs. Increasingly, James would interrupt my stories at dinner, particularly when I shared memories of my nursing days or his childhood. "Mom was about to tell us about delivering a baby during that snowstorm," Amanda would say, trying to include me. I think we've all heard that one James would interject, "Lily, tell us about your science project instead." Each interruption was a small wound, a message that my experiences and memories held no value at the table. His mockery of my occasional forgetfulness was especially painful. When I misplaced my reading glasses or called Thomas by James's name accidentally, my son would roll his eyes dramatically. "Senior moment, Mom," he would say with a smirk that held no warmth. "Should we start looking at assisted living brochures?" The children would look uncomfortable during these moments, too young to challenge their father, but old enough to sense the cruelty in his words. Even my cooking, once praised and appreciated, became a target. "Does everything have to have so much butter in it?" James complained one evening, pushing away a plate of my potato gratin, a dish he had loved since childhood. "It's Grandma's special recipe," Lily defended, loyally continuing to eat hers. "Well, maybe Grandma's special recipes need to catch up with modern nutritional science," James retorted. I learned to make myself smaller, to speak less, to take up less space. but even my silence seemed to irritate him, as if my very presence was an imposition. The most hurtful incident came unexpectedly on a snowy afternoon when James returned early from work. I was in the kitchen with the children, teaching them how to make my mother's famous chicken soup, a recipe that had comforted our family through countless illnesses and hard times. James walked in, his face tight with suppressed anger. "Amanda and I need to talk," he said tersely. "Can you take the kids upstairs?" I wiped my hands on a towel. "We're in the middle of making soup. Could you talk in your office instead?" His expression darkened. "This is my house, Mom. When I ask for privacy in my own kitchen, I expect to get it." I ushered the disappointed children upstairs, but not before hearing the beginning of their conversation. "How much longer is she staying with us?" James demanded, not bothering to lower his voice. "She's your mother, James," Amanda replied, sounding tired. "Where exactly do you expect her to go?" "I don't know, but this was supposed to be temporary. It's been almost 2 years. She helps with the kids. She cooks, she gardens, she contributes her pension." I paused on the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. "Her pension is a joke," James scoffed. $400 a month barely covers the extra utilities and food." I hadn't realized he was calculating my worth, so precisely measuring the financial impact of my presence down to the dollar. "That's not fair," Amanda protested. "Your mother gave you everything. She put you through college." "That was her job as a parent," James retorted. "It doesn't mean I signed up for a lifetime of reciprocal obligation." I continued upstairs, my legs shaking so badly I had to grip the railing. The children were too absorbed in their game to notice my distress, for which I was grateful. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the small desk in my room and carefully calculated how much of my pension I could afford to contribute to the household. The next morning, I approached James before he left for work. "I've been thinking," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'd like to increase my contribution to the household expenses. I can give $500 a month now." James looked surprised, then calculating. "That would help," he admitted. "But honestly, Mom, it's hardly enough to cover what you eat and the extra heating for your room." The casual cruelty of his response stole my breath. How had my beloved son become this person who saw his mother as nothing more than a financial liability? "I see," I managed to say. "Well, that's all I can afford at the moment." He nodded distractedly, already checking his phone for emails. "We'll make it work," he said, in a tone that suggested I was creating a problem rather than trying to solve one. In the weeks that followed, I became increasingly isolated within the home. Amanda, though generally kind to me, was rarely there, working longer hours as she pursued her partnership. James spent more time at his office or locked away in his home study. The children were my only real companions, but even that joy was tempered by James's constant criticism of how I interacted with them. "They don't need cookies every day," he would say. "And please stop telling them those superstitious stories about wishing on stars. They're just childhood traditions," I would defend quietly. "They're outdated," he would reply dismissively. "We're raising them to be rational, scientific thinkers." At night, in the privacy of my room, I would sometimes allow myself to cry, muffling the sound with my pillow so no one would hear. I would look at old photographs of James as a child, his gap-toothed smile beaming up at the camera as he proudly showed off a science fair ribbon or a soccer trophy. That little boy had looked at me with such love, such trust. Where had that boy gone, and what had I done to make him disappear? When I tried to reach out to bridge the growing chasm between us with memories or questions about his work, James would respond with minimal engagement, often checking his phone while I was mid-sentence. "Do you remember when we used to go camping at Lake Minerva every summer?" I asked one evening, trying to connect. Vaguely, he replied, not looking up from his device. That was a long time ago. You used to love catching fireflies in the evening, I continued undeterred. You had a special jar with holes punched in the lid. Mom, he sighed, finally looking up. Why are you always living in the past? Those camping trips were, 30 years ago? What's the point of constantly bringing up ancient history? His words cut deep. Our shared history, the foundation of our relationship, dismissed as irrelevant. The past that I treasured, that shaped who we both were, meant nothing to him now. As winter deepened into the darkest days of the year, I found myself wondering if there was any place for me in my son's life anymore. The woman who had once been the center of his world had somehow become an inconvenience, a burden to be tolerated rather than a person to be cherished, and I had no idea how to find my way back to his heart. January brought biting cold and early darkness to Mapleton. Inside the house, despite the central heating, a different kind of chill had settled, one that no thermostat could remedy. The distance between James and me had grown so vast that sometimes it felt like we were strangers sharing a space rather than mother and son. One Friday evening, we were having a family dinner, a rare occasion when both James and Amanda were home at a reasonable hour. Lily, who was working on a school project about family history, looked up from her plate with bright eyes. "Grandma, what was it like when you were young?" she asked. "Was the world really different?" I smiled, warmed by her genuine interest. "The world is always changing, sweetheart. When I was your age, we didn't have computers in our homes or cell phones. If I wanted to talk to a friend, I had to call their house phone or write them a letter. A real letter with stamps and everything Thomas asked, fascinated." "Absolutely," I replied. There was something special about getting a letter in the mail, knowing someone had taken the time to write just to you. "What about your job as a nurse?" Lily pressed. "Were hospitals different?" I nodded, memories flooding back. "Very different. We didn't have electronic medical records. Everything was on paper charts, and many of the treatments we have today didn't exist yet." "Like what Thomas asked?" "Well, many surgeries that are done with tiny cameras, now called laparoscopic surgery, used to require big incisions. Recovery took much longer, and some conditions that we can treat easily now were much more serious then." "Did people die more?" Thomas asked, with the directness of a child. Amanda admonished gently. "It's okay," I assured her. "Yes, Thomas, some conditions were more dangerous then. That's why I became a nurse, to help people when they needed it most." "And you raised Dad all by yourself, right?" Lily asked. "I did," I confirmed, glancing at James, who was focused on his plate. "Your daddy was the light of my life. I worked very hard to give him opportunities I never had." "Like college?" Lily asked. "Yes, like college. I saved every extra penny for his education. Sometimes I would work double shifts at the hospital, 16 hours straight, so we could add to his college fund." I was about to share the story of how I had surprised James with enough money for his first semester's textbooks when he suddenly put down his fork with a sharp click against his plate. "That's all ancient history, Mom," he interrupted, his voice cold. "Nobody wants to hear about the good old days." A heavy silence fell over the table. The children looked down at their plates, and Amanda shot James a disapproving glance. "I want to hear," Lily said in a small, brave voice. "Well, you can hear about it another time," James said with finality. "Let's talk about something relevant to today. Thomas, how was your math test?" The conversation lurched awkwardly to school topics, but the damage was done. I sat quietly for the remainder of the meal, pushing food around my plate, appetite gone. James had not just interrupted me. He had dismissed my entire life as irrelevant. Ancient history, not worth hearing about. Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, I was in the kitchen making a cup of chamomile tea when James entered. He opened the refrigerator, surveyed its contents, and closed it with a forceful push that rattled the condiment jars inside the door. "We're out of that imported beer I like," he said accusingly. "I didn't realize we were low," I replied carefully. "I can add it to the shopping list for tomorrow." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, studying me with cool assessment. "You do the shopping. You should keep track of these things." "I try to," I said, keeping my voice even. "But I focus on the essentials first, and specialty items sometimes slip my mind." "My beer is essential to me," he retorted. "After a week like this, I need it." "I understand," I said, though I didn't. The James I had raised had never spoken to anyone this way, let alone his mother. "I'll get some tomorrow first thing." He continued to stare at me, and I sensed that the missing beer was merely a pretext. Something else was brewing beneath the surface. "Do you have any idea how expensive groceries have gotten?" he finally asked. "Of course I do," I replied, surprised by the question. "I've been managing household budgets for over 40 years, James." "Then maybe you could be more mindful of what you're putting in the cart," he said. "The food bills have nearly doubled since you moved in." I felt heat rise to my face. I buy what the family needs and enjoys. I make most meals from scratch to save money. If there's a specific concern about the grocery budget, we could discuss it rationally. "The concern," he said, his voice taking on an ugly edge, "is that you seem to think money grows on trees. Those organic vegetables, the premium cuts of meat, the fancy cheeses the kids now think they need." "I buy what's healthy," I defended. "And occasionally I get special things as treats for the children. Is that so wrong?" "It is when I'm the one paying for all of it," he exclaimed, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea the pressure I'm under? The mortgage, the car payments, the children's activities, Amanda's student loans still, and now I'm supposed to subsidize your gourmet cooking habits." I set down my teacup, my hands trembling slightly. "I contribute what I can from my pension." He laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Your pension? Right. At your age, you're just a burden. You're useless after 60, and you're eating us out of house and home." The words hung in the air between us, impossible to take back. I felt as though he had physically struck me. The kitchen seemed to spin for a moment, and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. "James," I whispered, hardly recognizing my own voice. "Do you really see me that way?" Instead of backtracking or apologizing, he doubled down. "I'm just stating facts, Mom. You're not contributing meaningfully to this household. You're taking up space, using resources, and for what? So you can make cookies with the kids and tell them stories about the past that don't matter anymore." I stood very still, absorbing the full impact of his cruelty. This was my son, my only child, the person for whom I had sacrificed sleep, food, relationships, and dreams. And he saw me as nothing more than a financial drain, a useless burden. "I see," I said quietly. "And is that how you'd like your children to see you when you're my age? As useless, as a burden?" "That's different," he said, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps the first shadow of doubt. How I pressed, finding a strength in my voice I didn't know I still possessed. "How is it different, James?" "I've provided for them, given them a good life, a nice house." "And I didn't provide for you?" I asked softly. "I didn't give you everything I possibly could?" He looked away, unable to meet my eyes. "That was a long time ago." "Yes, it was. but I would have thought the memory would last longer than this. I gestured to the space between us. Then whatever this has become. A tense silence stretched between us. Finally, James pushed away from the counter and said the words that would change everything. "Just stop eating so much of my food in my own house, okay? We're not made of money." With that, he left the kitchen, leaving me standing alone with my cooling tea and a heart that felt shattered beyond repair. That night was the longest of my life. I sat on the edge of my bed, surrounded by mementos of a life that apparently held no value to the person who should have cherished it most. Photos of James throughout his childhood and youth. The Mother's Day cards he had made by hand. A small ceramic pot he had crafted in third-grade art class. Lopsided, but given with such pride. Through the wall, I could hear James and Amanda arguing in low, intense voices. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone told me enough. My presence had become a source of conflict in their marriage as well. As dawn broke, spilling pale light through my curtains, I made a decision. I had raised my son to be independent, to stand on his own 2 feet. Now it was time for me to do the same. Not because he was right about my worth, but because staying in a place where I was so fundamentally devalued was slowly killing my spirit. With a strange calm that comes from absolute certainty, I began to make a mental inventory of what I would take and what I would leave behind. My dignity, above all, would go with me. The following Monday presented the perfect opportunity. James had an early meeting at his firm. Amanda was due in court all day, and the children would be at school. The house would be empty from 8:30 in the morning until at least 3 in the afternoon. I went through my morning routine as usual, preparing breakfast for everyone, packing lunches for the children, and waving goodbye as they all departed for their respective destinations. Only after the house fell silent did I allow myself to acknowledge what I was about to do. I returned to my room and pulled my old suitcase from the closet, the same navy blue Samsonite I had used when Harold and I took our trip to Niagara Falls 5 years earlier. It seemed like a lifetime ago now, that happy journey with a man who had valued me until his last breath. Packing was an emotional journey through the artifacts of my life. Each item I placed in the suitcase carried memories, some joyful, some bittersweet. The photo album containing pictures of James's childhood was the first thing I packed, wrapped carefully in a soft sweater for protection. Whatever had happened between us, those memories remained precious to me. My nursing awards came next, including the silver pin I received for 25 years of service at Memorial Hospital. There had been a ceremony in the hospital cafeteria decorated with balloons and streamers for the occasion. James had been there, a young man of 28, then standing tall and proud as I received the recognition. "That's my mom," he had told everyone who would listen that day. How things had changed. I was selective about clothing, taking only what I truly needed and what would fit in the single suitcase. My everyday slacks and sweaters, sensible shoes, and a few items with sentimental value like the blue dress I had worn to James's college graduation. I left behind the newer items he and Amanda had given me for Christmas and birthdays. They had been their choices, not mine, and somehow taking them felt wrong. In my jewelry box, I found the locket Harold had given me on our 10th anniversary. Inside were tiny photos of him and James. I clasped it around my neck, drawing strength from the weight of it against my skin. As I packed, memories flooded back of another time. I had packed a suitcase in crisis. That was 35 years ago, after Richard left us. Then I had been packing for both James and myself as we downsized from a 3-bedroom apartment to a tiny 1-bedroom where James slept in the bedroom, and I made do with a pull-out sofa in the living room for 4 years until we could afford something better. The fear I had felt then was different. It was the panic of a young mother suddenly solely responsible for a child's well-being. The emotion I felt now was a complex mixture of grief resolution and an unexpected sense of liberation. There were items I knew I would miss but couldn't take with me. My collection of porcelain birds that lined the windowsill in my room, the quilt my mother had made for my 30th birthday, too bulky for the suitcase. The rocking chair that had been with me since James was a baby where I had spent countless nights singing him to sleep. Before leaving my room, I wrote 2 special letters, one for Lily and one for Thomas. I poured my heart into those pages, telling them how much I loved them, how special they were, and how none of what had happened was their fault. I explained that sometimes adults need to make hard decisions, but that my love for them would never change. I included my friend Doris's phone number and address, telling them they could always reach me there. I hid Lily's letter inside her favorite book, The Secret Garden, between pages 100 and 101, where she was currently reading. Thomas's letter went into the treasure box he kept under his bed, beneath his collection of special rocks and feathers. I knew they would find them soon. In the kitchen, I placed my handwritten recipe book on the counter. It contained generations of family recipes, including James's favorites from childhood. I had been adding to it for decades, intending to pass it on to Lily when she was older. Now, it would remain with the family without me. There was one more thing I needed to do before leaving. I went to the small desk in my room and wrote a brief note to James and Amanda. I won't be a burden anymore. My key is by the door. I considered writing more, explaining my feelings or expressing my hurt, but what would be the point? James had made his perspective crystal clear. No words of mine would change that now. I took one last walk through the garden I had lovingly tended since moving in. The winter landscape was sparse, but I could see the daffodil and tulip bulbs I had planted in the fall, waiting beneath the soil for spring. I wouldn't be here to see them bloom. That thought brought a surprising pang of loss. Back in the house, I took my house key off my keyring and placed it on the entry table along with the note. Beside it, I deliberately left the folder containing all my financial records, including the document showing that I had contributed $35,000 from my savings after Harold died toward the down payment on this very house. James had asked for it as a loan, but we both knew it was a gift, one I had never mentioned since. Now perhaps he would remember. With my suitcase in hand, I took one final look around the home that had never truly become mine. There was sadness in this departure, but also a quiet dignity. I was choosing to leave rather than stay where I wasn't valued. At 68 years old, I was beginning again, a thought that was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. I closed the door quietly behind me and walked to the bus stop at the end of the street. I had already called Doris the night before, an old nursing colleague who had remained my dear friend through the years. She had immediately offered her spare bedroom for as long as I needed it. "Michaela," she had said firmly, "you always took care of everyone else. It's time someone took care of you for a change." As the bus pulled away from the curb, carrying me toward Doris's apartment across town, I felt a complicated mixture of emotions. There was grief for what I was leaving behind, particularly my beloved grandchildren. There was hurt that still throbbed like a physical wound when I thought of James's cruel words. But underneath those feelings, like a small flame flickering to life, was something unexpected hope. Hope that at 68 years old, I might still create a life that honored my worth, even if my son could no longer see it. The bus wound through familiar streets that gradually gave way to a different neighborhood. As the landscape changed outside the window, I realized I was entering not just a new part of town, but a new chapter of my life. What that chapter would hold, I couldn't yet know. But for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely again, no longer shrinking myself to accommodate someone else's diminished view of my value. When the bus stopped 3 blocks from Doris's apartment building, I stepped down with my suitcase, nodded a thank you to the driver, and began walking toward my future one careful step at a time. According to Doris, who heard it from her daughter who worked at Lily and Thomas's school, James's initial reaction to discovering my absence was annoyance rather than concern. He had called my cell phone, which I had left behind deliberately, and found it charging in my room. "She's probably just out shopping or at the library," he reportedly told Amanda. "She's making a point. She'll be back by dinner." But as the evening progressed with no sign of me, his annoyance had shifted to irritation. "Now the kids are asking where she is, and I don't know what to tell them," he complained. It wasn't until he found my note and key that the reality began to sink in. Even then, according to Amanda, who later confided in Doris's daughter James, had shrugged it off. "She's being dramatic. She'll cool off and come back in a day or two." The children, however, had been devastated. Lily had found my letter that very evening while reading before bed, and her sobbing had alerted the household that something was wrong. Thomas discovered his letter the following morning and had refused to go to school, clinging to his mother and demanding to know where I had gone. I heard all this secondhand, of course. I had deliberately disconnected from the situation, needing space to heal and reflect. Doris's cozy 2-bedroom apartment became my sanctuary. She lived on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian home in the old part of Mapleton, with tall windows that let in streams of winter sunlight and a small balcony overlooking a park. "Take all the time you need," Doris had said when I arrived, helping me unpack in the spare bedroom that would become mine. "This is your home now for as long as you want it." Those first few days were a blur of conflicting emotions. I would wake up disoriented momentarily, forgetting where I was expecting to hear the sounds of my grandchildren getting ready for school. The silence would hit me anew each morning, along with the realization that I had left behind the daily rhythms and relationships that had structured my life for the past 2 years. But there was also relief. Relief from the constant tension, from walking on eggshells, from seeing the disappointment and dismissal in my son's eyes. In Doris's home, I didn't have to make myself smaller or less visible. I could speak without being interrupted, exist without being evaluated for my usefulness. Meanwhile, according to Doris's network of informants, I never knew retired nurses could be such effective. Intelligence gatherers' chaos had erupted in James and Amanda's household. The carefully choreographed morning routine I had managed fell apart almost immediately. The first day after my departure, both children missed the bus because no one had laid out their clothes or prepared their lunches the night before. James had to drive them to school, making him late for an important client meeting. Dinners, which I had always prepared, became a haphazard affair of takeout and frozen meals. The refrigerator, which I had kept stocked and organized, quickly descended into disarray. The garden, even dormant in winter, began to show signs of neglect. Most significantly, the children's behavior and academic performance began to suffer. Thomas started having nightmares and wetting the bed, something he hadn't done since he was 4. Lily became withdrawn at school, and her teacher reported that she seemed distracted and sad. After about a week, James's attitude reportedly shifted from dismissive to worried. It began when he went looking for some important tax documents and found himself rummaging through the filing cabinet I had always maintained. The documents weren't where he expected them to be, and he had no idea how to locate them in the system I had created. His frustration led him to the folder I had deliberately left on the entry table, which he had initially ignored. Opening it, he found not only the tax documents he needed, but also the record of my $35,000 contribution to their home purchase. according to Amanda, who later told the whole story to Doris James, had sat at the kitchen table with that document in his hands for a long time, completely silent. "I'd forgotten," he finally said, "or I didn't want to remember. She never asked for it back." That was just the beginning of his discoveries. As he began to pay attention to the household finances in my absence, he realized how much I had actually been contributing, not just in terms of childcare and cooking, but financially as well. My monthly contributions from my pension, which he had dismissed as negligible, had in fact been covering all the utilities and the children's after-school activities. More revelations followed. Amanda, freed from the peacekeeping role she had adopted in our household tensions, finally expressed her full anger at how James had treated me. "Your mother was the only reason I could work the hours I needed to make partner," she told him. "Do you have any idea how much professional childcare would have cost us? Or how much the children benefited from her attention? You treated her like she was nothing, James, like her only value was economic." The children, too, made their feelings known. Lily, in particular, began challenging her father's version of events. "Grandma didn't leave because she wanted to," she insisted. "She left because you were mean to her. She told me in her letter that she loves us, but she couldn't stay where people made her feel bad." As his home life deteriorated, James began a desperate search to find me. He called the few old friends of mine whose numbers he had, but I had asked them not to reveal my whereabouts until I was ready. He checked with local hotels, and even called hospitals, afraid I might have fallen ill somewhere alone. Finally, in his desperation, he began going door to door in our neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen me leave or knew where I might have gone. It was a humbling experience for a man who had rarely spoken to his neighbors before. What he discovered surprised him. Not only did the neighbors know who I was, many of them had formed friendships with me during my daily walks or gardening. Mrs. Abernathy from 3 doors down told him how I had tended her roses when she was recovering from hip surgery. Mr. Liu from across the street mentioned the weekly tea times we shared discussing books and swapping stories. "Your mother built a community here," Mrs. Abernathy reportedly told him. "She noticed who needed help and gave it without being asked. When my grandson was struggling with math, she tutored him twice a week." Did you know that? James hadn't known. There was so much about my life he hadn't bothered to learn or acknowledge. The most devastating revelation came from Mr. Petrovich, the elderly widower who lived next door. He had been watching James knock on doors up and down the street and finally approached him as dusk was falling. "Your mother built this life for you," he said simply, "and you threw her away." Those words, according to Amanda, hit James like a physical blow. He came home that evening and finally broke down sobbing at the kitchen table in a way she had never seen before. "I don't know how to fix this," he kept saying. "I don't know if she'll ever forgive me." It was later that same evening that he found the letters I had left for the children. Lily, after some hesitation, allowed him to read hers. The simple, loving words I had written with no blame or recrimination, only reassurance of my enduring love, apparently undid him completely. "She still loves us," he said in wonder. "After how I treated her, she still loves us." All of this I learned in pieces during the quiet evenings Doris and I spent sharing tea and conversation in her cozy living room. I listened to the reports of James's growing remorse with complicated emotions. There was a part of me, I must admit, that felt a grim satisfaction. He was finally seeing all that I had contributed, all that I was beyond the narrow valuation he had placed on me. But there was a larger part that simply felt sad. Sad that it had taken my absence for my son to recognize my worth. Sad for the pain my grandchildren were experiencing. Sad for the broken relationship that might never be fully repaired. Meanwhile, I was building a new life step by careful step. Doris had introduced me to her circle of friends, mostly retired professionals, who met weekly at the community center for various activities. I joined their book club and a walking group that explored different neighborhoods each Saturday morning. More significantly, I began volunteering at the Mapleton Community Health Clinic 3 days a week. My nursing license had lapsed years ago, but my experience was still valuable in supporting the clinic's outreach programs. I helped teach basic health classes to young mothers, many of whom were immigrants still learning English. I assisted with blood pressure screenings and vaccination clinics. For the first time in years, I was using my professional skills again, and the satisfaction was profound. "You've found your purpose again," Doris observed one evening, as we prepared dinner together. "I can see it in how you carry yourself." She was right. Something had shifted in me. The woman who had left James's house with a single suitcase, broken-hearted and uncertain, was gradually being replaced by someone more confident, more engaged with the world on her own terms. 3 weeks after I left, as January gave way to February, James finally found me. He had remembered an old Christmas card from Doris and tracked down her address. According to Doris, who fielded his call while I was volunteering at the clinic, he had sounded desperate. "Please," he had begged. "I need to see her. I need to apologize." When Doris told me about the call that evening, I sat quietly for a long time considering what I wanted to do. The hurt was still raw, the words "useless" after 60 still echoing in my mind. But there were the children to consider, and the decades of love that had preceded these recent painful months. "Are you ready to see him?" Doris asked gently. I looked around at the small, peaceful room that had become my refuge, at the new books on the nightstand, at the simple vase of fresh flowers I now bought for myself each week. I thought about the young mothers at the clinic, who looked to me for guidance, the new friends who valued my company and insights. "Yes," I said finally. "I think I am." James arrived at Doris's apartment the following Sunday afternoon. She had tactfully arranged to visit her daughter, giving us privacy for our conversation. I watched from the window as he parked his car and sat for several minutes, seemingly gathering his courage before getting out. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath, smoothed my sweater, and went to answer it. The man who stood on the threshold looked different from the son I had left a month earlier. There were new lines around his eyes, and he seemed to have lost weight. But it was the expression on his face that struck me most forcefully: uncertainty, fear, and a desperate hope all mingled together. "Mom," he said, his voice cracking on that single syllable. I stood aside to let him enter, but didn't immediately move to embrace him. There was too much between us for such easy reconciliation. "Hello, James," I said quietly. "Please come in." He stepped into the apartment, his eyes taking in the cheerful space that had become my home. Doris's collection of art from local artists brightened the walls, and the afternoon sun streamed through the large windows. On the coffee table lay several books and the course materials from the community health classes I had been helping to develop. "You look well," he said, sounding surprised. "I am well," I replied. "Would you like some tea? I just made a pot." He nodded, following me to the small kitchen, where I poured 2 cups of Earl Grey, his favorite since college. We carried them to the living room and sat across from each other, an ocean of unsaid words between us. James wrapped his hands around the mug as if seeking warmth, and finally looked directly at me. "I've been looking everywhere for you." "I know," I said. "Doris told me." "The kids miss you terribly," he continued. "Lily reads your letter every night. Thomas carries his everywhere, even to school." The thought of my grandchildren clinging to those words made my throat tighten with emotion. "I miss them too, very much." "Mom won," he began, then faltered. He set down his tea untouched and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I don't know how to begin to apologize. What I said to you, how I treated you, there's no excuse. No, I agreed calmly, there isn't. My directness seemed to surprise him. Perhaps he had expected me to make this easier for him to immediately offer forgiveness and comfort, as I had done all his life. But some hurts go too deep for easy absolution. I was wrong, he continued. So wrong. About everything. I was stressed about money, about the project at work, about Amanda's hours, and I took it all out on you. But that's not an excuse. Nothing excuses how I made you feel. How do you think you made me feel, James? I asked quietly. He flinched at the question, like you didn't matter, like your value was only in what you could contribute practically or financially, like your history, your experiences, your wisdom had no worth. He paused, swallowing hard. Like you were, to useless. The word hung in the air between us, the cruel knife that had finally severed our relationship. Do you know what that did to me? I asked. To hear those words from my own child, the person I had given everything for. I can't imagine, he whispered. I keep thinking about how I would feel if Lily or Thomas ever said something like that to me, and it's unbearable. It was unbearable, I confirmed. That's why I left. He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. I found the record of the money you gave us for the house. I had convinced myself it was a small amount that we could have managed without it. But it was your life savings, wasn't it? It was what Harold and I had set aside for our retirement travels, I acknowledged. But after he died, your need seemed greater than my want. And you never mentioned it again. Never held it over us. That's not what mothers do, James. No, he agreed, wiping at his eyes. But children should remember and be grateful, not resentful and cruel. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared history pressing down on us. I've been volunteering at the community health clinic, I said, eventually changing the subject, teaching health basics to young mothers, mostly immigrants. It's been very fulfilling. James looked up, surprise evident on his face. That's wonderful, Mom. Yes, it is. I agreed. I may be retired, but I still have a lifetime of knowledge to share. The clinic director has asked me to develop a more comprehensive program. You always were an amazing teacher, James said softly. I remember how you used to explain things to me when I was struggling with school. You never made me feel stupid, just helped me see the problem in a different way. The memory brought a small smile to my lips. You were always bright, just impatient sometimes. Some things never change, he admitted ruefully. Mom, I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or maybe ever. But I want you to know that I've realized what I lost. Not just someone to help with the kids or keep the house running, but you, your wisdom, your stories, your presence in our lives. I studied my son's face, seeing in it traces of the little boy who had once run to me with skinned knees and broken toys, trusting that I could fix anything. I also saw the man who had wounded me more deeply than I had thought possible. Could those two realities coexist? Could we build something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed? James I said carefully, forgiveness isn't a single moment. It's a process, and it takes time. I can't just erase what happened or how it made me feel. He nodded, accepting this difficult truth. I understand. I just want a chance to try to make things right somehow. What would that look like to you? I asked. He thought for a moment. I don't know exactly. I know I can't ask you to come back and pretend nothing happened. Too much has changed. He glanced around the apartment. You seem to have built a new life here. I have, I confirmed. It's different, but it's mine. For the first time in many years, I'm making choices based solely on what I want and need not on what others expect from me. I'm glad, he said, and seemed to mean it, but the children, they need you in their lives, and I need my mother, not as a housekeeper or babysitter, but as the wise, strong woman who taught me everything important I know, even if I forgot that for a while. His words touched something deep inside me, a place that still held love for this flawed man who was my only child. I think we can find a way forward, I said finally, but it needs to be different from before. I won't put myself in a position to be devalued again. No, he agreed quickly. Never again. We began tentatively to discuss what a new relationship might look like. Sunday family dinners at a restaurant neutral ground, where I would be a guest, not a servant. Regular visits with the grandchildren, perhaps one afternoon a week after school. Phone calls to stay connected between visits. "And you'll stay here?" James asked, looking around the apartment. "For now," I said. "Doris and I get along well, and the arrangement suits us both. Eventually, I might look for a small place of my own." He nodded, accepting this boundary I had drawn. "The clinic work, that sounds perfect for you. You were always happiest when you were helping others learn." "Yes," I agreed. "Though it's ironic that it took leaving your home for me to rediscover that part of myself." James winced at the gentle rebuke, but didn't deny its truth. "Sometimes we have to lose something to understand its value," he said quietly. As our conversation continued, I began to see signs of genuine change in my son. He spoke about how the experience had forced him to reevaluate everything from his priorities to his understanding of worth beyond economic contribution. He shared how Amanda had confronted him with hard truths about his behavior and values. "She told me I was becoming exactly the kind of man I always said I despised," he admitted, materialistic, dismissive of anything that couldn't be measured in dollars. She was right. Most surprisingly, he told me about his decision to offer his architectural services pro bono to help the community center expand their facilities. They need more space for their programs, including the health clinic. "It's not much, but it's a start at trying to give back." As afternoon faded into evening, we reached no dramatic resolution, no tearful embrace that magically healed all wounds. Real reconciliation, like real forgiveness, would take time and consistent effort. But we had taken the first steps on that path. When James finally rose to leave, he hesitated at the door. "The children would love to see you when you're ready." "I'd like that," I said. "Perhaps next weekend we could meet at the park if the weather's good." He nodded, relief evident in his expression. "They'd love that. I'll make sure we're there." He paused, then added, "Mom, thank you. Not for forgiving me yet, but for being willing to try. I don't deserve it." "This isn't about what any of us deserve," I replied. "It's about choosing how we want to live going forward. I choose to have my family in my life, but on terms that preserve my dignity." "I understand," he said, and I believed that perhaps finally he did. After he left, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights come on one by one as dusk settled over the city. I felt drained, but also strangely peaceful. The future remained uncertain, but I had faced my greatest fear, the loss of my child's love and respect, and had survived. More than survived, I had found new strength and purpose. In the year that followed, our relationship slowly rebuilt itself on a new foundation. True to his word, James never again treated me as a convenience or measured my worth by my utility. Our Sunday dinners became a cherished tradition, and my afternoons with the grandchildren were precious time to rebuild those bonds. The community health center expanded with James's architectural guidance, and my program for new mothers grew beyond our initial expectations. At 69, I found myself busier and more fulfilled than I had been in years, using the wisdom and experience of a lifetime in ways I had never anticipated. The most profound change, however, was in how James came to view aging and contribution. He began to truly see the older people in his community, to value their stories and insights, rather than dismissing them as irrelevant. He brought his architectural students to interview elderly residents about how spaces could better serve their needs. He established a mentorship program at his firm that paired experienced retired architects with young innovators, creating teams that combined wisdom with fresh perspective. One warm spring day, almost exactly a year after I had left James's home with a single suitcase, I stood on a small stage at the community center, accepting an award for my volunteer work. Looking out at the audience, I saw my family watching with proud smiles: James, Amanda, Lily, and Thomas, alongside Doris and my new circle of friends. In that moment, I understood the deep lesson that had emerged from our painful journey. True worth isn't measured in economic terms or practical utility. It lies in the wisdom that comes only with years lived fully, in the perspective that allows us to distinguish the essential from the trivial, in the stories that connect generations and preserve our shared humanity. The value of a human being doesn't diminish with age. If anything, it deepens and expands like a river that grows wider and more powerful as it nears the sea. In the end, it wasn't about being useful or useless after 60. It was about being seen for who I am. Not for what I could do, but for who I had always been: a whole person, worthy of dignity and respect at every stage of life. Have you ever had to walk away from something or someone you loved to preserve your dignity? How did it change you? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear its message. Remember, your worth never diminishes. With age, it only transforms. Thank you for listening, and may you always be valued for exactly who you are.